And we are live with week 2 of the 60-day novel challenge. Hello, everyone. My name's Doug Lansborough, one of your 3 hosts, joined by my friends Hank Garner and Josh Hayes. How are you doing, gentlemen?
Fantabulous.
If I were any better, I'd be Josh.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's true. Sure can confirm.
I'm going to stall for a few seconds here while we let people trickle in, let their phones and computers update and say, hey,
Wait for
those fine folks are live now.
Yeah.
But
well,
this
the
is
fine folks and Hank.
Yeah. And Hank. Yeah. I love being tagged at the end of a conversation. And Hank. It's actually my favorite thing. Yeah.
Hello, TW, and hello, Brandon from Oregon.
Yeah, I popped in earlier and I saw Brandon was here and ready earlier. So I hope you're still there, Brandon. And TW, always a pleasure.
We have Steph and Ray in the chat as well. Welcome, all these familiar faces.
Welcome.
Great to see everybody.
Were we supposed to be ready?
just in general?
Ready-ish.
Yeah. Interesting.
So today we are chatting about characters. This week is all about characters, and it is honestly a very big week. If you're following along with the template, I was just talking to to Hank. I was just chatting with Hank about how much work I've been doing in the template, because there are so many exercises to go through if you want to fully flesh out your characters. And for some people that's exciting, for some people that's daunting, for some people that's, some things they're not going to touch at all because that's not part of your process, and that's okay, because we have 3 different processes here on the show that we're going to talk about this whole time, while going over what's in the template and honestly what makes good characters. So we have
only one of those is correct.
Yeah,
only one of the ways is correct.
Yes.
See, I tried to be positive there for you. We have a handful of other folks joining us. We have Jeffrey, Jane, Helen. Hello, David from London, England, not Ontario. Brittany from Arkansas. John, good morning. Well, good afternoon for myself. Good morning for some folks. Good evening for some folks as well. Wow, I'm rocking it today with the words. This is why I'm a writer. Because I can edit it afterwards.
Hank said he was drinking. I'm pretty sure you've been.
You're doing really good for someone that English is their second language, Doug.
All right, with the antagonism out of the way for now, because I shan't respond to that. I'm above that.
He said shan't, Hank. Raise your little finger while you drink your tea.
In the template this week, there were a bunch of exercises for you to complete, or that you will complete before our live stream next week. And in that, you go through things like the different types of characters, your main characters, like your protagonists, secondary characters, tertiary characters, if you have any in mind, but we'll chat about why you really don't need to think about those beforehand. And then you could take those characters that you brainstorm and dive as deep as you want into them. We're talking backstory, forming their character arcs and mapping those out, and looking at the relationships they have with other characters. He
speaks Canadian.
If you do all the exercises, honestly, you could write 50,000 words worth of stuff just from these exercises if you went all in on it. Now, we're trying to be efficient in this program, right? We are writing a 50,000 word novel. That means we don't have a ton of space for the most intricate relationships, or a whole plethora of them, if I'm sticking with my fancy English.
I don't know if we're gonna be able to keep up, Hank.
Do what you can
for the ride.
Do what you have time for, and do what works best for your story. As far as the exercises, we'll dive into them a little bit deeper. That was just my little introductory spiel for them, because I do want to throw some questions to my 2 distinguished hosts here. And we're going to start with, how do you go about coming up with characters for a novel? And you feel free to break it down for like your protagonist. How do you come up with them? Your antagonists, secondary characters, what have you?
This is something I've been thinking a lot about this week, because For me, a story almost always begins with a character. So, I I'm not sure how I at least come up with my protagonist, and I'm kind of thinking through this because a lot of times a new story idea comes from a new character that just walks onto the stage of my mind, or I'm out in some sort of social setting and I observe someone, and as all writers do, you start playing the what if game. Oh, that would what if a person like this were to walk in and say this? And then you're like, "Ooh, that's provocative. What would happen then?" And then it just kind of starts scaling up from there. You got the Russian nesting dolls that kind of, you open this up and there's a whole other thing. Um, so I'm the appearance of a protagonist as a little bit of black magic, in my mind, but then subsequent characters almost always come as a way to support that protagonist or to antagonize that protagonist. And I rarely think about plot uh, as a structure, but I'm thinking about how characters interact with this person or with this group of people, whatever that is. So, I don't know, protagonists just kind of show up, but then everyone else, there's a method to the madness. I'm interested to hear how you guys may differ from that, or if it happens similarly with y'all.
Similar. I kind of start from a baseline of what do I need,
Yeah,
and I kind of merge that with what do I want. Um, uh, for this particular story, I've been doing a lot of work the last week and a half. I started doing some character last week and kind of went down a rabbit hole as I always do when I'm doing this kind of work. Usually when I outline and plot, I do it on a legal pad and I just
yeah,
write down notes, and it's quick for me to do that, and it's very easy to rip the page up and throw it away if I don't want it.
right.
Um, but I have an idea uh, of a name sometimes. Sometimes I change it for the main character. I have an idea of what I need from that main character, from the primary antagonist, and what I want him to do. And for this particular story, I wanted a guy around my age, who spent 15 years in the military and then uh, 5 years or so working with the CIA in paramilitary operations, and now he's in kind of a special unit. And so I wanted him to be uh, competent and a very skilled and experienced kind of operator in that sense. And I wanted to build a team around him that kind of had different specialties. And I kind of started that as the baseline. For instance, I've got a female who she's a crazy. She could drive anything. She could drive any car, motorcycle. She flies planes. She's super smart. She's also a good shooter. And I start from that baseline. And then I have another guy who's a marksman. He's a sniper, but he also does other things. That's just the baseline. And I kind of go down through what I need in the story. And for right now, and I think it'll probably stay here, I've got 6 team members. One of those is Cooper. He's the main character, and then the other ones are kind of secondary to that. But I just start at the baseline there, and then I kind of, if I have an idea for like a character quirk or something like that, I'll add that in, but I don't go super deep. I had an idea for the explosives medical guy to also be like a really good gourmet chef, like just like kind of like throwing an oddball out there, because
Yeah.
you don't normally think of like a special forces operator being a gourmet chef. And so I just kind of like try to see little things that I can put in the profile, and then as I go through the story I add things. I don't go
So,
too
so
far
it's
in
almost
depth.
like you're casting almost like you're casting a heist novel where you're bringing together a
Yeah,
team of specialists
it's
and
It's kind of like
Yeah.
it's more loosely based on like a Mission Impossible format, but it's
Right.
also like quasi military, but more paramilitary in a sense where it's so like at least one of the people on the team is not military. He's a
Yeah.
computer hacker and he's a felon and like just kind of coming up with different characters to use. The One of the other secondary characters is actually based on a friend of mine, and I sent him a text. He was a Marine, and I sent him a text and I said, "Hey, I need a character for my book. Can I use you?" And he was like, "Absolutely." And I said, "Cool. You're an ex special forces operator, and now you do private security. So nothing like you because you're not an operator, but it's gonna be cool." And he laughed. Um,
Usually when
but
I
I
ask my friends if I can use them, they're like, only if I die in a horrific way. It's
and that's normally what I do
yeah.
too. I read, but he's my best friend, and he sang at my wedding and held all my kids. So I figured I'd give him a cool spot in the book. But
Yeah.
I typically don't go super deep. Actually, a lot of times when I'm writing a story, if I need names for tertiary characters or just kind of one-offs, a lot of times I'll just write name in big capital letters and keep going, because a lot of times that doesn't matter. What I did differently for this project than I have done before is I've been using ChatGPT for a lot of brainstorming sessions. I don't use it for any kind of writing. I don't ever ask like, "Can you give me a fight scene?" But like, if I need a list of names, I'll get a list of names. Or if I need like weapon specs, and usually I Google to make sure. But just little different things that are idea generation based that I want to kind of get a baseline of what is available or what's accurate. I use ChatGPT, but I also figured out that ChatGPT also does AI art generation, and so I used it this morning and the other day to kind of generate profile pictures for my characters. And this way, what I've done in the past is like you write down a little bio of like hair color, eye color, and all of this.
Yeah.
Um, but I figured if I'm gonna do that, I might as well just get the art and just put the art in the I'm using the Dabble character profile thing, and
Profiles.
you can
Yeah.
change the avatar picture. So I just put the picture in the avatar, and then I don't have to write down all that other stuff. I can just
Yeah.
look at the picture and go, "This is what they look like." And I've never done
I've
that
done the
before.
same
And
thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
Cool.
What
I
we have
do.
said is that ChatGPT or Claude or any of the other chat, bots, where they really shine is when a lot of times when you're brainstorming a project, and like if you and I were talking and kind of bouncing ideas off each other, and
for
you're
sure.
kind of using that as an idea generator, and where another person is kind of acts as a springboard almost. That's where, for me, chat bots, chat agents, whatever you want to call them, really shine is when you're able to kind of pitch ideas back and forth and iterate upon those, but
Right.
getting feedback and not having it do the writing, but what if, and kind of playing that game. That's where
Yeah.
it really has been handy.
Oh yeah, it's been great.
I
Yeah.
do want to take a second here. Jane asked, "What do we mean by tertiary character?" And when we say stuff like that, we mean so there's your three different types: your main or your primary, your protagonist, and sometimes your antagonist, depending on how involved they are in the story. Secondary characters are like the sidekicks. Antagonist often falls into this category too if it's not a big part of the story, or like if they don't get a lot of screen time. Mentors, rivals, that kind of stuff. And then tertiary characters are generally like flat characters or minor characters who will come in, play a very specific role for like 2 lines of dialogue, and then never be seen again.
Yeah.
Tertiary character would be like if your character landed at an airport and they've got to go to a hotel and they get in a cab and the cab driver drives them, and you give the cab driver a name and have
Mhm.
him interact with the character. That would be a tertiary character because you're never going to see him
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. I
But
Well, a
there's
lot
like
of
also
times,
different levels of those too. Like you can
yeah.
have several different levels of tertiary, even several different levels of primary and secondary as well.
Mhm.
It's just an easy way to classify. Yeah, cast Tetris, exactly.
Yeah.
Just an easy way to classify that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of times a tertiary character can be used as a catalyst to change something, but you don't necessarily need them to be part of the change. Like you
Yeah,
said, Josh, a cab driver or something is a good pivot point for something to bring information out, or to have some way to pivot a scene, but you don't need them to necessarily be a big part of it, but you can use them to
Right.
bring some new information or to allow you to pivot in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of those characters come in what I call bridge scenes or bridge
Yeah,
sequences,
Yeah.
where I've
right.
got like main plot element sequences and scenes that really focus the story. But if I need like a gap or a time stretch or something like that, I'll usually
Mhm.
use a bridge scene. And you could have a drive in a cab or a drink at a bar or just something that is really kind of innocuous and not really key to the plot. And those bridge scenes are really fun to play around with those kind of characters. You can do a lot with them. They don't have to be
Right.
cardboard cutouts. What I like doing is making my tertiary characters really quirky, either having
Mhm.
like a really interesting voice tick or even to how they dress or act. I've got a character in my book, Weaponized, that says "my guy" all the time, and he's like, "Hey, my guy, come over here." And I
Like the
like to
hand
do that.
gesture.
Yeah, but he's not Italian. I don't know why I did that because he's not Italian. Like, forget about it. But he does. I knew a guy that I worked with that always said, "Hey, come here, my guy, talk to me." And
Mhm.
I thought that was interesting, so I threw that in there. It's not something that I would probably use for a main character because he could get old really, really quickly.
Mhm.
But in a small sequence or a short scene or something, it's fun to kind of throw those things in.
Yeah. Now, when you are coming up with characters, regardless of which type they are, how do you make use of tropes or archetypes? Because when I was going through the exercises, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted my main character to be like, and then I thought, what tropes can I pull on to, make this a little more fun? And even though I'm writing dark fantasy, the dark part of dark fantasy pulls on horror, right? So I thought, what if we have like a final girl kind of trope, where she's not technically the last one alive, but throughout the story, she has a lot of those similar experiences to a final girl in a horror movie, where she just has to survive and endure things until the very end. So that changed a lot of what I want to write in this story and how I came up with this protagonist. But do you two use like tropes? Do you start with tropes? Do you think about an archetype before you make a character, or do you say, hey, this is what I kind of need and this might fit? Like, how do we use those tools?
I I kind of I kind of come at it from a kind of a like opposing side angle. So I like tropes and I like archetypes, but I also know intuitively that some of those tropes are bad. Um, like where some stereotypes are accurate, some stereotypes are actually, they're harmful or just inappropriate or whatever. So when I'm coming up with characters, I think about the archetype that I need, but I also think about the stereotype that goes with that archetype, and then I kind of like purposefully kind of fit the archetype and the character that I need, without being too stereotypy, if that makes sense. I like to have a diverse cast, in terms of being able to play with uh, the way different people interact with each other. And I also like to kind of turn things on their head, in terms of what people normally think of a stereotype as a character would be. um like the explosive expert that's a gourmet cook. That's not a normal thing. I like to do the trope but also twist it so it doesn't
Yeah.
fit a
Hmm.
long running stereotype. And then I I go through and just kind of see what fits and I play around with it. And sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't stick. I'm like, for what I was doing for my characters today was figuring out um which characters could or should be male, which characters could or should be female, and then trying to uh, play around with that to see if it works. And a lot of special forces combat units, there aren't many females in that role. Not because they can't do it or anything like that. They just typically aren't in those kind of units. And so to keep it accurate, I've kind of have to look at, if I'm going to have this team that's not like a SEAL team, it's not a Delta Force or Marine Raider or anything like that. It's a kind of like a Mission Impossible team where they have different roles. I can kind of play around with that and see, does this fit here? Can I make this interesting here? And I kind of like, I don't know, I kind of start with a blank page when it comes to characters, and then they kind of just generate, kind of grow as the story grows. But like, archetypes and stereotypes are great, but I think sometimes they're overused, even though you need, you know, I can't get away from the archetype of uh, lone gun hero, right? Because I need that in the book.
Mhm.
But I can play around with it. I can, some of those characters are like damaged. I'm not going to have a damaged character in terms of, what you normally think, wrecked marriage or whatever, anything like that.
Yeah.
Um, I try to keep it as realistic as possible, but also make it interesting at the same time, so it doesn't feel like you've read the book a million times or seen the same movie. And I don't know, characters. I love characters, man. Characters are some of the best things in story besides plot that I love to play with.
Hank, well, first of all, yeah, I agree. Like anytime you use an archetype or a trope, make it original, right? You have take a few traits so that you get that identifiable backing that can help a reader, but make it your own. We don't want anything stale. We definitely don't want anything that's harmful either. But Hank, what about you? Do you use these
I
things?
I do use them, but it's not something that I set out to use. It's not something that I sit and think, okay, I'm going to write this book. I need to make sure that I hit these
Mhm.
tropes. Um, I I think just being familiar with your genre, before you sit down to try to write a new book in this genre helps, because you just kind of understand the trope, so you're not coming to it having to think through these tropes, if that makes any sense. I know that sounds elitist
100%.
almost,
Yeah.
but I think it's just being immersed in the genre, so it just kind of comes out of your natural understanding. But when I do think about tropes, I think about ways that I could subvert the tropes, where you want to use something that's familiar to the readership so that they're comfortable coming in and picking up your book. First off, people don't want to be sold something and then have the rug pulled out from under them
Mhm.
be-
Right.
because it's something that they were not sold, or they didn't think they were sold. Um, but what is interesting is to take the thing that people expect and to twist it a little, and to
Yep.
so like Josh, if you're talking about the lone gun, who's the loner, you kind of build him that way, but then have him in a loving long-term relationship, and then you're like,
Yeah.
well, that's not how this usually works.
Right.
So find a way to play on the thing that people expect, but give them something new and fresh, and a new
Mhm.
twist on it. So kind of subvert the tropes when you can, without um without being disingenuous with your readers, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Subverting and not breaking are very key.
Yes, yes. You
Good
want to
distinction.
play in the playground, but push out to the fences a little bit.
Not with the other kids.
Right now with the
Go make
kids.
your own sandcastle.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, I am gonna pop up here just before we move past this, like types of character and archetypes and stuff. I'm gonna add. I didn't make any fancy slides because there's just so much content in this week's exercises. But here I broke down my main character, my secondary characters, and just brief descriptions of each. You'll note here that I actually use the linking feature in Dabble. So if you type, let me give a space here, you can choose something that you've already made a note for, like a character, or this is a type of creature that they're going to be going up against that I link to. So easy navigation for me. But just brief descriptions here, and then I made profiles for each one and even organize them into different casts here.
How did
And
you
then
do the in that section where you're looking at now, where you see the name and then the paragraph next to it, where it's
this,
formatted kind of justified over there? How did you do that?
I'll send you payment for asking after this.
Ah,
Uh,
yes.
if
The
you
whole
so if you're
50
at a
cent.
blank line and hit the plus button, you can choose property list header or property list. Header will give you this bold one here. So Doug's coolest features.
Yes.
And then it'll automatically start a property list so we can do physical, dashing good looks.
Oh, that's
Then if I hit
amazing.
enter, it'll be personality, charm, suave, humor. I'll do the American spelling for you. I'm going to delete that now, so it's not in my story when I go to write some more. But this is what
That's
our
very
first
interesting.
exercise looks like. And then down here, just a quick jot note area. I put tropes that I want to avoid. So the damsel in distress trope, because I'm going with that final girl kind of trope, I really don't want to come anywhere near the oh no, I need to be saved, because it's all about her surviving. And then I was looking at dark fantasy tropes. And one that came up that a lot of people don't like, and I personally don't like either, is just everyone sucks. Everyone's just a terrible human being. Like, part of dark fantasy is how everyone, like, a lot of people do stink and they're awful and they're really bad people, but I find it very, like, almost too gray when everyone is just the worst version of themselves. So I want to avoid that as well with my characters. And then jot down some tropes or archetypes that I want to I want to use as a basis for some characters. So yeah.
We got Jacob said, are tropes just something you pick up from reading a lot, or are there resources that describe tropes and genres they appear in? And I popped up this W article that Doug, did you write this one?
It depends on which one. If it's the
Uh,
romance one, no.
no, Abby wrote this one. That's why it's so good. No, just a joke, just a joke. This is a great article with examples of tropes, but this is a great reference. But if you read enough in a genre, you are bound to pick up some of the concepts that you encounter over and over again, and that's where I get most of my genre understanding from. But of course, there are great examples, and this W article is a great primer to get you started. So take this and then read a bunch in the genre, and I think you'll understand how these tropes appear over and over again and how writers commonly use them.
Yeah, we have some specific articles about romance tropes, fantasy tropes, sci-fi tropes, and even things like motivation tropes.
Right.
So
yeah. Go
So
to
yeah.
W and just search for tropes, and there are a number of great articles there.
Yeah. Alrighty. So let's move on then, because the second exercise in the homework that people are going to be doing for this challenge is all about backstory. And I have made it no secret that I'm such a big fan of character backstory. I think you can draw so much from it to make a character unique and engaging and well developed. So for you gentlemen, how do you go about coming up with the backstory for, let's start with your protagonist, and then if you have anything else for like secondary characters, whatever, you can say that as well. And then if you've already thought about it, what are some highlights for the backstory of your protagonist?
I tend to reverse engineer my characters. I know a lot of writers who will spend thousands and thousands of words just creating bios for characters and really going, yeah, you
Yeah, me.
giving just all of this information about a character. I don't tend to do. I do appreciate that, and I love hearing people talk about that. But what I tend to do is like I described earlier, I'll have a character that walks onto the stage in my mind is a way that I like to describe it. And then I start playing this game with them, like, who are you? What are you about? Why are you quirky in this way? And then start kind of developing reasons for why they're that way. And I kind of reverse engineer the character in that way. So that way I know what's important to me about the character and what their motivation is for that without going through I wish I could develop whole biographies for characters. I wish it was that way, but I'm just too I don't know if I'm ADD or whatever it is. I can't I like to just kind of discover them as I'm going. And as a former pantser who is now
Reformed.
a reformed plotter, a reformed pantser who's now a plotter. The thing that I still hold on to is discovery discovery writing my characters, discovering them as I go. And whereas I have a roadmap for where I'm writing, I still like there to be some mystery about the characters,
Mhm.
and sometimes discovering that will alter the story a little. Uh, I like to think that it's not going to change where the story's going, but it adds unexpected flavor to a story a lot of times.
Mhm.
So that's the one pantser element that I hold on to is to leave a little mystery about the characters that I can discover as I'm writing them.
I
What
tend
about
to
you, Jeff?
agree. I
What?
well, you've joined the Reformed Church of the Plotter, and so
I have,
I can
and I
agree
blame
with
you
you.
for it.
You're welcome. You're absolutely welcome.
Yeah.
Uh, I so a backstory for me is kind of an iffy thing because you also you always want to know where your character came from as kind of a baseline for developing that character, but a lot of the things aren't necessary for the story you're trying to tell. I know I've
Yeah.
said this before. I don't write things until I know I need them.
Mhm.
um, but I like what Hank said there about um, kind of pantsing the some of the elements of your character in terms of backstory, because it does leave the door wide open to do like an interesting, hey, do you remember that time when we went to South America and had a margaritas on the beach or
Exactly.
whatever? And that's stuff that you don't need to plan out. That's stuff that it can just naturally happen in the writing of the stuff. It's not, it doesn't need to be in your outline. It doesn't need to be anywhere. You might not even have thought about it before you started writing that day, and it just seemed like an interesting thing to put in. When planning out my backstory, specifically for the main character Cooper in my novel, I knew that I wanted him to be a certain age, and I knew that I wanted him to have a certain level of experience, and so I had to do something that I don't normally do, and I had to get out the calculator, do math, so I could figure out. Um, I want the story to take place in 2026 because I want it to take place after the Afghanistan drawdown that happened in 2020, and I want to give time for the characters to get out, go through the CIA, and then do this other thing. And then so I had to figure out um, how many years did he do in the military? When did he join? Um, and for this particular one, I did. He joined at 17, and then I do the math and figure out where to go from there. And then I do real brief, like got out because he was mad, and joined the CIA. Wasn't happy there. Like very very brief things. I don't usually go into detail about any kind of like did he have a specific mission that affected him in some point in time? Did he have a bad experience in the CIA? Why? Like all of that stuff can come later because it doesn't really affect what I'm trying to do as a baseline just for his the to get to know the character.
Mhm.
And I go very brief on the secondary characters. Like they were like my other secondary character based on my friend. I just know that he was a Marsoc raider and that's it. And now he does private contracting security for the corporation down where they're going. But other than that, I don't do a whole lot of work in that aspect. I kind of do. Uh, I kind of do a side by side, like while I'm writing. When I get to that point, if I come up with one of those stories where there's drinking margaritas or they went to South America and had a vacation or something like that, I will typically copy and paste that into a separate note file in Dabble somewhere, um, under the character, and then put in what chapter and what book I had that in. And leave that in the document so that I don't have to find it later. And then if I need to reference that, or if I'm writing a second book and I need to figure out, has he already told this story before, or does this fit with everything else that he's saying, I can go back and kind of look and see what I've already written. But that's not stuff that I have to pre-plan out or keep track of. I just know that I have to put it somewhere so I remember it. Um, the backstory for one of my other characters is a North Korean defector, so I had to do some work on when did he defect, how long has he been here, like when did he become a citizen. A lot of that stuff I haven't typically had to do before because I mostly write science fiction, and so I can just kind of come up with stuff, and it doesn't have to line up with any real world dates or times. But
Mhm.
for this specific instance, um, North Korea's from defectors from North Korea are very rare now. Where you used to have a couple thousand a year, now it's down into the hundreds and even into the dozens in the last couple of years because they've clamped down so much. So I had to do some research on the history of North Korea defectors, and pick a time. And I think in this particular instance, it was like 2008 because I wanted his daughter to be old enough to be a teenager to be friends with somebody else, and that affects the story too. So I kind of had to play around with those dates, and figure out what worked for the story and if it would be true in real life. So it's just some extra work that I'm having to do in this genre that I haven't had to do before, is make sure if I want to have a teenage daughter, how old is she? And does that make sense in the timeline of everything else? Could this have happened in the real world if it was an actual thing? So it's not a lot of work, but I go down rabbit holes and I start researching stuff, and I'll spend 45 minutes researching. Like this morning, I was researching the 6.8 Creedmoor round for like an hour, trying to figure out which combat rifles shoot it and the barrel length and suppressor capabilities of weapons and optics and all of that. That's all like legitimate to the genre. It really didn't have anything to do with the story, but I want to make sure that I get that stuff accurate. So I've been doing a lot of research in that.
Cool.
But for character, a lot of times it just comes as I write, and I have a general idea of what I want to do. But as long as I have the story plot down, I can kind of uh, shoot from the hip, as it were, with everything else.
Yeah.
We have here in the chat someone agreeing with you two, saying you guys are putting a smile on my face because I did the same processes in creating my characters in Save the Cat app, learning from the book, so they know they've been on the right path, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Not, and when I say this next line is not directed at that viewer or writer, it's directed at you two. When I said you were distinguished gentlemen before, I take it back because I love backstory. I get lost in it so much. Loyal Foundation,
love
you are still
backstory
distinguished.
so much that you would rather write a series Bible than write the series.
I would,
know,
and I've said
I
that
know
to you
you.
beforehand. If I could get paid to just world build, I would
Right.
absolutely do that. But no, we have some mixed opinions about how much people love backstory in the chat here, and folks like Ray and Jane and Purple love backstories. Brittany is writing historical fiction based on a real person, so they're deep in the backstories, and character development is more about that emotional journey from the facts, which is awesome. On Tuesday, I did a character development workshop for this challenge, and anyone who missed it or just wants to rewatch it, it is on our 60 days playlist, so you can go rewatch it until the end of November. And I went into backstory quite a bit there, not because I just want to brainwash all of our dabblers into following my way of writing, but because it's so easy to take something from backstory and tie it into a character arc and make that development a little bit more meaningful. So when I go about my protagonists, I really look into their backstory and look for what I call the big hurt, which other people call the ghosts or the shard of glass, I believe is another term for it. That traumatic moment in their backstory that then created the lie or the wound that they have, which is like this misinformed belief they have about the world, right? And I absolutely love that because I do so many terrible things to my characters that I take that lie, I take that very traumatic moment, and I just keep, harping on it throughout the entire thing. So for me, that's why I like backstory so much. There are logistical purposes for it as well, like figuring out how when you had to defect so that you could have a daughter at a certain age and whatnot to make the story make sense. And a lot of characters, I will explore their backstory as I'm writing, but I use the backstory to really drill in on that protagonist's weakness, their biggest weakness, and what I can use to exploit and ultimately fuel their character arc with.
I actually had
Well,
um, uh, a situation where I was trying to figure out how to do what you're talking about and set up that tragic event in the past and have that inform why the characters are the way they are now. And my original idea was to start the book with that event as like a prologue. Um, but as I got into it and kind of realized how many different pieces that I needed to connect to make it work, the
right.
prologue became like 3 chapters. And then you would have to do like a big time jump between the prologue and when the actual story starts. And I felt like if I'm going to jump 6 years in the future and skip all of this other stuff, then I don't need that.
Mhm,
I can have it as part of the backstory and I can use it in the narrative, but to start with it doesn't make a lot of sense if I'm skipping all the rest of the important stuff that also would affect the character. So I'm starting as their real mission starts, and then I'm going to pepper that backstory and through the story so that gradually you understand how they get to where they're at.
and
which I
and
think
let
is the
me
best
just
way of doing it.
let me
Sorry, go
just
ahead.
say that as a reader, I love backstory. I love that there are things that have happened that maybe I don't know yet, but I know I'm going to discover. But as a writer, I don't necessarily need to know what those things are. I'm thinking of a specific example of this book that I wrote where I had a protagonist that I knew something horrific had happened to him, but I didn't know what that was exactly yet and what the specific fallout for that was. But I know 10 years later, he is affected by this moment. And I don't have to mine all of the specific hurt that brought about this. I just know that there was this thing. And
Mhm,
then as the story unfolds and it comes to a point where I need to specifically talk about this thing, um, then I could work that out. But I didn't need to know all the details to begin with. I just needed to know there was a thing. And that was good enough for me, because I'll just do horrible things to people on the fly. I don't need to work it out ahead of time, you know?
we're a panel of jerks. We're
Right.
Yeah. Well, and the one thing I want to add really quickly about backstory too,
Yeah.
in this might not be a very popular belief, but it's definitely accurate, is uh sometimes your story, depending on what you're trying to the story you're trying to tell, you don't need backstory. Sometimes you don't need it. Sometimes you don't need that thorn in your side. You don't need the tragic event. Sometimes the backstory of what happened before the character starts their journey on page one doesn't matter at all. A good example of this is my novel Strikers War, where there is no backstory. It's just that they start and we follow them through the novel, and we experienced the tragic events firsthand, and we didn't need anything else motivating or pushing the characters in a certain direction. The opposite of this would be the backstory of the Gray Man, Court Gentry in the Gray Man books, which you for like the first 5 books, you have absolutely something happens, and you know that it's big and it's massive, and the CIA is trying to kill him for it, but we have no idea why, and even he has no idea why. And you don't find that out until book 5 or 4 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so, in that particular instance, that backstory was literally driving the character, and it was completely independent of the plot of each individual book, but it was very important to Court's past and who he is as a person. But sometimes backstory isn't necessary. Sometimes you can spend a lot of time thinking about that, and if you don't need it for the story you're trying to tell, then it really doesn't matter.
We got a great comment from Brittany that I'd like to pop up on the screen for a second because I think this is worth talking about. As I'm writing historical fiction based on a real person, I'm deep into the backstories. My character development is more about finding emotional journey from the facts that I have. This is where I would uh, differ in my personal opinion about backstory. when you're dealing with historical fiction, we're talking about true events that we are then filling in the cracks that we
Mhm.
don't, that are not necessarily part of the public conversation about historical events, as opposed to alternative history, where we take a, almost an archetypal person that is mythological almost in the status they've, and we create stories that probably could not have happened to them. I'm thinking Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter or something like that. That's very much alternative history.
That's not
Or was
historical
it?
fiction. That's why I
Well,
thought it was true
Yeah.
story.
I'm just saying, in parts of the South, there may be different attitudes about Abraham Lincoln, but that's neither here nor there. That's neither here nor there. But as opposed to like, there's a huge trend over the last decade or so has been World War II historical fiction, where we know that there's uh, these stories about, people finding love during the invasion of Normandy, for instance. We know there are factual events that happened around Normandy. We know the people that were there and the troop movements, and all of that has to be correct, and we need to make sure we nail those historical points. But the things we don't know is where you have the freedom to move in and out of that. But you kind of need to know that backstory so that you have the freedom to move in and out of those things. So historical fiction is where I would definitely segment myself and say that I would definitely want to make sure I'm fully informed on the correct backstory, so that the places where I do take liberty, I'm free to take the liberty within those bounds. That's a place where boundaries are a blessing.
For sure.
See,
Yeah.
for Brittany's comment there, I'm actually going to pop it back up for
Yeah.
1 sec. I focus more on finding the emotional journey from the backstory. That's
Right.
that's why I like backstory so much, and why I'm being so antagonistic to you two. It's because that's where I
I
pull
love
all of my.
backstory.
Yeah, and I'm just messing around, but that's
I
where
know.
I pull a lot of my emotions from. And
Yeah.
specifically, I'll talk a little bit about the backstory work I did for my character for this challenge. She's in a book that exists already, right? So I have the character, but I don't know what's happened to her for the last, she's not human, so she's however many thousands of years old. Didn't map all of those millennia, right? Didn't do that. That's not the point I'm trying to make. But I thought, okay, what happened to her to make her the way she is that I can use in this story? And so she used to be a very confident, very skilled warrior, and then she did something really stupid, really brash and arrogant, and it got her best friend killed. And that's
Mhm.
her big hurt for me. And the trauma that comes out of that, the lie that comes from that, is she thinks that she's only good when she's following orders. Now she lacks initiative, she lacks confidence as a result of this, and that's why when I throw her by herself in this horror fueled nightmare, she's going to learn from it, right? But as I'm mapping this backstory out, she also has her commander, who she eventually falls in love with, or they fall in love with each other. But I didn't know what their backstory was either, and as I was doing this work, I realized, okay, why don't we actually make it so that these three were like best friends? They were very tight, kind of grew up together, ended up in the same unit together. And then this best friend's death actually impacts him as well. And so now there's more relationship that I can play with from this backstory. And that's why I love it so much, because there's just so many. By doing, I think it was like 2,500 words worth of backstory work that I did for this character. So like I went deep, right? But by
Nice.
doing that, I have so much that I can work with now, and that's why I personally love spending all that time in
And I
I
love
will say
that you
that
love that.
yeah.
it. Thanks, Hank.
I love that for you.
Yeah.
Um, the one time I will say that not doing backstory ahead of time has backfired on me is specifically with Weaponized, because I knew that there was a MacGuffin, and the entire time I was writing the first draft of the book, I thought I had an idea about what the MacGuffin was, and then I got about 80% in and realized I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know why. And then it took me, uh, man, it took me several days to figure out what this thing was going to be, and to have it make sense and have it push all these different elements of the plot, because I didn't take the time ahead of time to think about it, because at the time I was writing a character arc thread that didn't have anything to do with the MacGuffin, because I was writing the plot thread separately. And so when I get to the point where I actually think, I think it was in book 2 when I realized I had made the mistake. I was halfway through book 2, because got to a scene where they were specifically talking about this thing and why it was such a big deal. And I go, well, why is it such a big deal? And then I had to go back and try to figure it out. And that took days and days and days of work. Oh my God, it was horrible.
I just want to highlight a couple comments here. David saying that they love the idea of updating your backstory as you write, which I think is great. I think that's very good. And I don't want it to sound like you need to map out the extensive backstory of a history before you get started. But I do think for a 50,000 word in a month challenge, especially if it's like your first book or your second book, the more pre-work you can do to make your life easier when we write, the better. But definitely update your backstory as you write. And especially if you're doing a series, if you update it in Dabble as you write, then when you go and add that second book, you have all that information right there. You don't need to go searching for it.
Yeah.
And
I
then
agree. Let your backstory be a living document. As you come up with ideas, add it to that, and then when you're done, it looks like you were a genius from the beginning, and you're like, oh, look at all this, look at all this work that went into this novel. And you're like, well, I mean, it was just me really taking notes so I didn't forget what was going on.
Well, and I think I mentioned this. Did I mention it in our last one? I can't remember. But if you do keep track of it all, then you can repurpose it for like bonus content for your readers too. Give them a little treat every now and then with a
That's
little
right.
sneak peek into their backstory or something.
Yeah.
And
All of the
then
content that you create is usable content, especially if you are taking your writing career seriously and you're cultivating a readership. None of that stuff should just be held on to by you. Um, there's an opportunity for everything that you create, and that's a discussion for another time. But keep that in mind.
Alicia said, when I called us a council of jerks, that's what a writer is. And then TW asked if I've plotted all of this in Dabble, this being the backstory, which is a great segue. So I haven't plotted it into the plot grid. However, if I add this back onto here, I did go through and I filled out the step 2 exercise, which is backstories, goals, and motivations. So when you're doing this, like a lot of this is just jot note kind of stuff. But then once I jotted down some stuff, I went and I could fill it in other places, right? So this is the kind of backstory that you're going through. And sorry, this is actually just the template, but if we go here, okay. You see it's a little bit longer in relationship dynamics, for example, at the start of the book, this is what relationships are going to be like. And then a quick description of the big hurt that I just talked about and the lie that comes as a result of it. And all of that, the more I typed, the more I did this work, it was like exploratory writing if I was actually writing the book like you do, Hank. So it's the same thing, different stage of the process.
Yeah. And that the exploratory work in your outline is the term that Josh has always said, that he pantsers the outline, which is just a funny dig at pantsers, but that's same kind of concept.
Oh, I love it.
But what I will have TW for week 4 is when we talk about the plot grid. I will have the entire thing mapped out extensively for that, if only just to show it, but also because I think like there's a lot of power in the plot grid and a lot of stuff that I could discover personally. So we'll get that when we get there.
Yeah.
And I'll try to have, I know we use the plot grid differently. I'll see if I can get some of my stuff up there, and maybe we can kind of show the alternative, an
That would be
alternative
cool.
way of using it. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now let's move on. So for those watching, we are approaching the hour mark, which is normally what we try to limit this to, but we established last week that this character show is big. There's a lot to talk about. So we're gonna keep going. We're gonna go well through the hour mark. And if you can join us, that's fantastic. But distinguished gentlemen, you're back to being distinguished in my book.
Yes.
Let's talk character arcs. And specifically, do you have an idea of the arcs that you want your character to go on, or do they have an arc at all? Is it a flat arc? Like what do you have in mind? Lay it on me.
Well, my character definitely has an arc because I established from the beginning, he's a writer. He is, I gave him a time crunch that he has a goal that he's trying to accomplish, and he has a limited amount of time to do it. And then a dead body shows up on his doorstep, not quite literally, but kind of, and this interrupts the flow of him achieving this goal. So the things that he will learn throughout this whole process will make him a stronger writer, will help him to achieve some goals, will help him in his relationship with his girlfriend, who owns the mystery bookshop, who is uh, kind of his sidekick that helps him to kind of mine the resources that are out there. So all of these things help to accomplish these things, and he will hopefully by the end of the book be at a more elevated place in his career, in his relationship, in his goals. um so there's definitely a character arc to this story, and it will not be flat. And I'm giving him problems so that he can elevate through those problems, and that's most definitely a goal for this book.
Excellent.
I don't I don't know that I have a specific yeah, 100%. It's very
Ray knows.
volatile.
Yeah.
I don't have a specific character arc in terms of what my main character is going to go through, like on a personal level. I don't envision him being a flat character, like a James Bond type character where he resets after every mission. But I definitely want to adjust him as we progress through the one novel, and hopefully subsequent novels after that. I do want to kind of adjust how he does things and why he does things. In terms of this particular book, the the arc for him is uh going to have to be figuring out how to do what he normally does with significantly less resources, because they're not supposed to be where they're at. And so, even though he's on this really cool, super secret spy team, he's not down there on official orders. He went down there to help a friend out. And so, his resources, while technically uh, in operational terms are unlimited, he has to go down there with just basically what they can get on the plane. And then through the story, those resources are going to diminish, and he is going to be in essence cut off from any kind of support. If you're familiar with any kind of paramilitary operation, they usually have like a US military unit that's standing by as like a quick reaction force to help them if they get really deep into it. That's right out of the window. They're not going to have that when they go down there. And then the normal resources that they may have through like the CIA, they may get initial access to, but then that access gets cut off. And then I have an idea in mind where the executive that runs the team or is in charge of it has another mission that he's got that has come up, and he orders the team to go, and then the entire team goes except for the main character. And so he goes from having a whole team of support to just him by himself with maybe one or two other people that help him, and he's got to figure out how to accomplish his mission with just himself and a couple other people. And he spent his entire career kind of in the military and then again in the CIA, so he's used to having all these different resources and things available to him that he can use at a phone call. And now he's not going to have those, and he's going to have to figure out how to do that, and also how to avoid all the, not only the actual bad guys, but the local law enforcement, the local like federal investigation team, like all of these different antagonistic forces that aren't necessarily involved in a conspiracy against him, but they're all working against him for their own individual goals. And so it's not really a character arc in terms of like the character changing throughout the story, but it is going to affect how he operates and how he does different things and then how he accomplishes his goal. So um, we'll see if I can, if the story does well and I can write more, then I'd like to definitely adjust some of his character things in a more meaningful kind of personal level. But I don't know that I can. I don't know that this is the book for that.
That's fair. And I think so in the workshop we spoke about character arcs as well. Of course, they're very, very important for characters, right? But we broke it down into 4 different types there. We have the positive, the negative, and then flat. But within flat, I group transformational as well.
Mm,
And so, like you alluded to, James Bond is a very flat character because he
right.
resets at the end of each adventure. Like you said, I like that term. But there's also transformational where like they don't change their morals necessarily, or like their character essence doesn't change, but they change in some kind of way. And I use Katniss from the Hunger Games as an example because she goes from
Mm,
hunter and District 12 member to rebellion leader, but her character is more or less still the same. It's just what she does is different,
right.
right? So it's
100%.
yeah. And I think a lot of people also get hung up on when they hear positive, some people say moral ascending arc, which isn't necessarily the case. You can have a positive or negative arc that is just a positive or negative change for the character without them conquering some deep-seated fear or becoming a more corrupted version of themselves. So all arcs are good arcs, in my opinion.
I love the arc of I don't know if you're familiar with Warcraft, the game. There's a RTS game and a
Mhm.
multiplayer online game. One of the characters in that is called Arthas, and his negative character arc is probably one of the best negative character arcs I've ever seen done in any kind of fiction. It is like
Nice.
one of the most amazing downward spiral arcs where he believes that he's doing right.
Mhm.
And I mean, he like commits genocide on a whole city because he thinks he's right. He kills his dad because he thinks he's right. And it just is, it's not a happy story, but the arc is brilliant. The arc and how he goes through the different stages of his life and how he gets to that point is really, really amazing.
I'll have to look into it because I'm a sucker for a negative arc. I love them.
Oh,
But I'm also a
it's one of
sucker
I
for
it's it's so good that I spent the money for a uh
oh,
really
I
nice.
recognize the character for sure.
Yeah.
Uh,
There's tons of videos on YouTube you can check out that they have. One of them I think is like an hour long and it goes through his whole life and it's really good.
I will check it out. Absolutely. He becomes okay, so he is the Lich King. Okay, good to know.
Yes,
'Cause
Arthas becomes
I
the Lich
know the
King.
Lich
Oh yeah.
King. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so for my arc, normally in the past when I've written a story, I've come up with the plot and then I kind of shape the character's arc to fit the plot that I need, more or less. This time around, I went about it a little differently because I knew what the beginning of the story was, I knew what the end was, and I kind of knew what the climax was, but I really didn't know what I wanted in between, say for a couple scenes. So when I was doing all this work for these exercises, I started mapping out my character's arc and that became the structure for my plot, which opposite day for me, but it was cool and it was a neat way of doing it. And I know I'm gonna have to fill in more things, like have other scenes that I want in there. I have things that aren't affecting her arc, but it was a neat process for me to think, okay, this is the trajectory I want her to go on, and these are the events that I want to have happen to her, and how does this fit into my story, or how do I shape my story to fit that? So that was a neat little exercise for me, uh, that I did, and we'll see how it turns out. But what I did for the exercises is the first part is what I'm calling a 4-sentence summary, which is where you jot down who they are when they start, what pushes them away from being who they are. So your inciting incident, if it's the main plot, the biggest challenge they face, which will end up being your climax, and then who they become at the end. And this is kind of like a little elevator pitch of your character's arc that, if you and I were getting coffee or in an elevator, you could list this off to me and I'd be like, okay, yeah, I get that. and tidy little summary. But also in the exercises is the 9-point character arc. And so I went through everything is normal, which is a lot like the ordinary world. Interrupt their normal with that inciting incident. Then an important part in most arcs, especially when you're dealing with a very qualitative change in somebody, is them wanting to not leave who they are. They kind of want to stick to what they're used to, right? And then the rising action is when you throw a bunch of crazy stuff at them. So I put that in jot form notes or point form notes here, jot it down for different scenes I want. Flip it on its head, it lines up with the midpoint for me. And then they go towards the climax, look like they're going to fail, fully commit to their new selves, and then they're done. They're through it. And so this 9-point format, which I'm going to be honest, I got to give credit to Abby because she's the one that came up with this in a W article. This completely changed the way that I mapped out my story. So that's what folks can look forward to in this week's homework, is figuring out their character arc, as insofar as you want to figure it out that way. It's ultimately up to you, and a lot of character arcs you will probably figure out the finer points to as you're going through it. So if you can't get down those 9 points, don't stress out. If you can't get down, half the stuff that we're throwing your way, don't stress yourself out. We're just doing whatever works for you for your writing style.
Let me interject this. As I was going through some of these exercises and really kind of pinning down who my characters were and what their arc was going to be, I'm changing what my novel is going to be. I originally thought that I'll write a cozy mystery. I'd never written one like that. I kind of like the idea of the genre, and then as I started going through this character, um, uh, um, process, that I started realizing I wanted more from my character. I wanted different things for them. I wanted to put them through a different um, arc of accomplishments and emotions, and I realized that genre was not going to meet those needs. And I started thinking this is really going to be more psychological thriller than cozy mystery.
We really pivoted.
I really pivoted, and which is kind of weird because some of the cozy mystery or what I'm latching onto, close community, a cast of characters you could use over and over again, like setting up a series. I like that idea. I like that kind of building a world that you could return to. And what I was not connecting with was the kind of joke nature of a lot of books in that genre. And I just really was not feeling that. I didn't feel like I authentically write that. Even though I write dark fantasy, I'm not going to write an R-rated book per se, as I want to write my kids can read, that I'm embarrassed for my kids to pick up, or an old lady that I go to church with, I'm embarrassed for her to read it. I that's just not who I am by nature. But I also don't just want that doesn't automatically make it a Hallmark movie, if you understand what I'm saying. Like, you can a broader range of emotion than going through this, really exploring my characters ahead of time helped me understand that the genre expectations, and to go back to the things we were talking about earlier in the show, those things were not gonna serve the story. So I started pivoting the way I was going to tell the story based on what I discovered characters from going through this.
That's really interesting. And Josh, I don't know if this is happening to you too, but Hank, your video's getting a little choppy for me.
Oops, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah,
we got
it's a
like
little
98%
roboty,
of what you're saying. So
Okay.
we got all the good words.
yeah. When you were saying, "Oh, Doug, you're the best person I've ever worked with, and I'm so happy to know you." No, but that's really interesting too, and it's cool that you can make that adjustment based off of this sort of work. So very cool.
Well, and that it goes kind of back to the the type of story you're trying to tell when you're coming up with your character tropes. And for a dark fantasy or a grim dark or epic fantasy or whatever, the opportunity to have a villain that's just an evil guy that's just
Hmm.
bent on world domination, that is part of the genre. Those tropes are acceptable in that genre. In the book I'm trying to write, I can't have just an evil guy. That doesn't make any sense. And so you have to come up with uh what is the bad guy, and what is their motivation. And in a cozy mystery, you might not have a bad guy. You just have an antagonist that's working against the protagonist, and that doesn't mean that he's an evil person or a bad person. So really, and that goes back to knowing, understanding the genre you're trying to write. It really will define the type of characters that you need to write. And if you're creating characters that don't fit that genre, but that's the story you want to tell, then like Hank, then you've got to shift focus a little bit and say, okay, this is the story that I want to tell. It doesn't fit into this genre. What do I need to do to fit into the genre that I am now aiming for? If you're going for psychological thriller, does that change some of these other plot points that I've come up with that maybe fit cozy mystery, but don't fit psychological thriller, and then adjust as you go? And it might not necessarily mean you have to throw out the whole scene. You can just change either how you present the scene or certain elements of that scene or sequence to fit into the genre style, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that. Um, Speaking of tropes, though, I missed this question from Purple here. Ideas for subverting tropes. Specifically, they have two characters that they don't want to make cliches that bore them and the reader, because if they're bored, then maybe the reader will be too. How, like, I guess, what's your top tip for subverting a trope if you want to use one or you're thinking about one?
Um, well, he's used the example here of reformed bad boy. That it's a that can be a trope in almost any genre that you write.
Mhm.
And depending on genre will kind of dictate how you present that and what type of bad boy they were. Were they an axe murderer, or were they just a pickpocket, or were they a liar, or it kind of really, the story kind of dictates what you do with that. Um, but the reformed bad boy it's a good trope. Sometimes it's overdone because everybody wants to root for kind of the underdog, or everybody's like, oh yeah, the bad boy go. Um, uh, if you have two really similar characters, in this case maybe reformed bad boys, look at them and go, do they really need to be reformed bad boys? Can they fit another trope idea? Or if they are reformed and they are a nice guy now, could they have just been a nice guy all along? Or I try to make them as unique as possible in terms of where they came from, if they're a reformed, because it might not be necessary for that particular character to be reformed. um, just look at Honestly, it comes down to what the story needs. And if the story needs that, then I think go for it, shoot for it. But there's, I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of different types of people in terms of types as how you group into, like, personality or attitude or whatever. And a bad boy could just be like, he doesn't talk a whole lot. He might be perceived as a bad boy, but he never really was. That if you have one that was a bad boy and now he's not, and one that was perceived as one, that could serve your purposes, but also throw that twist on, he's actually really not, and he never was. He was just misunderstood and maybe not liked or something like that. And those kind of things are really interesting because that stuff happens all the time. People that don't talk and they're like, this guy's rude, and I'm like, he's just not talking. How is that rude? And so it's just, you can play with other characters' perceptions of that character and make those perceptions kind of project their own kind of feelings about that character, even if they're not true.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hank, any ideas?
I agree with everything Josh said. I would just add to that, when you think, um, a lot of times, um, it's easy to make an assumption what is meant by that trope or by that archetype, and then just look at ways that you could um, bend the rules a little bit.
Play it on 0.5 speed.
Yeah.
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 Just look for what the reader's not expecting. Like if you like we talked about earlier, that lone gunman kind of trope, but then give him a solid family life or something that people assume about him, but in reality is different. And then that opens the door for, well, what could this mean? What is his big hurt? If the thing that I assume is his big hurt is not actually it, then what is? And that kind of playing that what if game really opens the door to take your story in directions that you never planned, or
A good
maybe
example
the
of that is
reader doesn't
a
expect.
movie that came out a while ago, and I don't remember what it's called, but it's the actor from Better Call Saul, and he is at fundamentally he's like kind of a John
Oh,
Wick
yeah.
character,
Yeah. Is it Nice
but
Guy or something,
it,
or
it might be called The Nice Guy. I can't remember, but
okay.
he's a family guy, right? He has kids, and when we meet him, he's with his family and he's loving and all of that, and then he gets pushed into doing some pretty horrible things. So that juxtaposition of, holding your baby boy and kissing him on his forehead and I love you and playing ball or whatever, and then you walk outside and you shoot somebody in the face, like that's something that you're not expecting, right?
Mhm.
And it throws that. Is he a family guy, or is he a stark raving lunatic that kills people? Those are interesting tropes to play with. Reversing him, is he a mad guy, or is he just a really competent killer that doesn't want to do that anymore, right? So like those kind of things are really cool to play with.
Yeah, that was Bob Odenkirk in Nobody.
There you go.
Um,
Nobody. Yeah.
it
Great
was a
movie.
fun movie.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah, David Dasty, Nobody.
I'm gonna drop out for just a second and restart my browser and see if I can get a better
Yeah,
internet connection. I'm dipping in and out, so I'll be right back.
for sure.
Okay, cool.
For my own subverting tropes, like I like to think, hey, here's the trope, flip it on its head like a complete 180, and then see what that looks like. And then if it's too much, walk it back a couple steps.
Right.
So like to Hank's point, give the lone wolf a family man. But maybe I'd even go further. Maybe a family man who gets stressed if he can't call home after 2 days, and which will be very common in his line of work. Right. So there's a flaw you can work with to make the character interesting, or that might be too much, and then you walk it back a couple steps, whatever it might
I
be.
love the idea of having a kind of a superhero type, whatever assassin character. But if he doesn't call his wife every day, he gets in really big trouble, and he doesn't want to be in really big trouble. So, like, maybe he's going out and he's killing an enemy leader somewhere, and then he's like, crap, I'm gonna be late, I've got to call my wife or I'm gonna be in super big trouble. Like that, I think that's those kind of little things, because that's real. Like,
Yeah.
if I don't text my wife or call her back, then I get in a lot of trouble, and I'm not a assassin, so I can only assume, like, those things are fun
uh,
to play with.
Before we move on to the next one, if you whoever is in chat with us hanging out, if you want to participate, let us know what you think your character's journey is going to be like. A simple, they are and then they are, whatever statement, right? They are, in the case of mine, they are hesitant and self-conscious or inactive to the point it's dangerous, and they become, a little more confident and dangerous. I don't know. I'd write it down so it sounds nicer, but something along those lines if you want to share. Welcome back, Hank.
Did I miss anything good?
Yes.
No, just rambling. We are going to move on to our last part about from the character exercises, and that is relationships.
Oh,
And
the "Where's my
relationship.
super suit" line from David. That is an amazing line in that movie. That's one of my favorite lines. "Where's my super suit?" Love it.
Is that from The Incredibles?
Yeah, it's from The
No. Yeah.
Incredibles.
Okay.
Is it, it's Frozone or Miss is that I think it's Frozone is the
Yeah.
character
Yeah.
name.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
I
love
can
that's
see it now.
hilarious.
Jacob here, the boss, saying that they are extremely shy and become leader of a group. That's a great arc. right? And there are a million
Yeah.
ways you can go about that, but that's great. It's in the laundry and it's not dry yet.
Yeah.
Okay, relationships. I think a lot of people, when they start writing, when they hear relationships, they just think romantic relationships, right? And that is
Yeah,
so far from the
right.
case. It is a valid relationship, to be sure, but it's really not the case. So specifically, I want to turn to you gentlemen, distinguished or not, and ask, how do you use relationships for character or plot development? Take your pick.
Okay, so for me, all story is character. Um, Plot is secondary to character. For me, at least, that's how I think about stories. Is I think about um, people, what they go through, what they accomplish, and how they and what their relationship is to other people. Um, and that's all story comes out of that for me. So relationships are either um, kind of show up as a hindrance to the character or a an opportunity for growth or um, I don't know. It's kind of the central point of everything that I write is how people interact with other people. So for me, relationships are the whole story, in one way or another, and that no matter what genre you're talking about, it's a person and what another person is, how that's affecting. So to me, that's everything.
Cool.
For this particular story, I don't have any romance. I typically don't write a lot of romance, just because I know I'm not very good at it. Um, but it's also not the story that I want to tell either. So
Mm,
most of my stories don't need that. Um, the key relationship issues I'm working with in this story are number one is friendship and brotherhood between the two kind of main operator characters, where the main character is going down to help a friend with a situation that he has, and then I'm kind of chaining relationships together because the friend has a daughter, and that daughter is best friends with the uh, North Korean scientist that gets abducted, and his daughter gets abducted too. And so I chain relationships in that the main character is now quasi forced and motivated to go into this thing to save not only his friend's daughter, but his friend's daughter's friend and her family. And so in this particular instance, the main character doesn't have a bromance, 100% bromance. He doesn't have a personal stake in the uh, pivotal event of the story, but because of his relationships with his friend, he is kind of morally obligated from a place of internal motivation to help and to do something about it, and it's the right thing to do. And I like to play around with some of those relationships in terms of friendship, but loyalty. And I have in the past played around with loyalty to different things, whether it's loyalty to your friends or loyalty to government or loyalty to whatever it is, and kind of playing around with, is one more important than the other, or does one mean more than the other? Or if you're doing one thing based on a relationship to, like, say, a government, does your relationship and loyalty to your friend trump that, even though they're both kind of really important? And playing around with those aspects of relationships, I kind of find really interesting. I was on another podcast where we were talking about military humanitarian missions, and how in some circumstances where if you go into a place that's been utterly destroyed, kind of like what's going on the East Coast now, where people are really dealing with
Mhm.
food shortages and struggling to get through them the day to day. Like, what does that do to people, and how does that change their relationship with the people around them? And you've seen post-apocalyptic movies where family guys turn into just uh, you know crazy killers that are killing to protect their family, and they would never have done that in that circumstance. And those kind of relationship items and aspects I really really enjoy playing around with. Um, maybe at one time I would like to do some kind of romantic involvement with a character somewhere in some book. I don't know. I don't know how to approach that correctly.
Well, and what I meant by interpersonal relationships is not necessarily romantic. For me, it's very rarely romantic, but
Mhm.
it's how people interact with each other. But like you were saying about the environment, uh, shaping how people interact there. Jacob, well, I'm sorry, I pulled up the wrong one. Jacob said, "Do you consider the relationships between a character and a setting in this, like the relationship with the wilderness and a survival story, or the relationship with a magical wizarding school and main character?" I think you were touching on that, Josh. How the environment can absolutely um, what the environment can absolutely affect how people relate with each other. But what do you think about people relating with the environment, like Jacob is alluding to here? I'm thinking of how this could manifest in a story that I would tell. Well, first off, the story I'm working on with this little town, and I talked about it a little bit last week, how the town has changed from what it used to be to what it was forced to morph into as the industry changed. Um, that definitely affects uh, how the people in there interact with each other based on the society that's built there. So that's uh one way. Do you guys think about how the physical place affects
I
the
can think of
relationship?
a great example of environment affecting relationship in uh, a setting where, well, like in say in Yellowstone, if you've ever watched
Mhm.
Yellowstone, they're talking about the land, and one party views the land in one way and another party views the land in another way, and they both want to take advantage of the land in very drastically different ways, and that creates a lot of tension because one person has a very direct personal connection to the land and the other person just see dollar signs, and so that affects how they are going about their day-to-day lives, where one person respects the land, one person does not, and you can kind of play around with that in various ways. It doesn't have to be that kind of black and white, but it's what when you're dealing with environment and setting and something as small as a house. If you're dealing with a house and ownership or something like that, where one person wants to bulldoze it for a parking lot. The other person, it's their grandfather's home, and it's been in their family forever. You can definitely play with those aspects to really ramp up tension in those circumstances.
Yeah.
I think building off that, I think that's more um the setting is like a catalyst for relationships or a huge influence on it. To Jacob's question, I don't think for like I'm going to say like 95% of cases there isn't necessarily a relationship in our sense between a character and a setting. They might like a setting, it might impact them, but relationships, when I write them, I always think about them as two-way streets. Right? How does this character affect this character, and how does that character affect the first one? When it's a setting, you have a two-way effect, but there's no intention from the setting. And so there's no agency, there's no autonomy, and so it's not really a relationship insofar as I think a catalyst.
In
I think maybe
Jacob's
the only
example,
other example of that could be like in Star Trek, where you have the Enterprise, which is a setting, but the Enterprise is also a character,
Mhm,
and then you have the crew, which is also a character, and they kind of complement themselves, and even the audience views the ship as a character in the story.
mhm. Yeah,
uh,
yeah, so
in
I
in
think there
Jacob's
are.
in
Go
Jacob's
ahead.
example of the magical school, if we're talking about something like Harry Potter or Hogwarts,
Mhm,
I think because of the magical sense and the otherworldly sense of Hogwarts and the spirits that live there, it really almost takes on a character of its own in the in the in the magical nature and the place holds this other realm, or it's a doorway to another dimension almost, and in that way it kind of becomes a character, but it's really uh, a placeholder for a lot of characters, really. But it can be seen that way, that the school, the place, is a place where you can encounter other characters that you normally can't. So I guess kind of
Like, to
it's
an
kind of a gray
extent,
area.
I think we're bordering more on like English class analysis
Yeah.
than practicality at this point. Because ultimately, you can say in that sort of relationship between like Harry and Hogwarts, that's a line on his character profile,
Yeah.
right? Feels safe at Hogwarts or is in danger at Hogwarts. Whereas if you have an actual other character, then there's a lot more going on between the two of them. How do their goals and motivations support or conflict with one another? How do they feel towards one another? How do they speak to one another? Like, there's a lot more to relationships between characters, that I don't want. I don't think people should get bogged down too much on setting, unless like we've mentioned with our handful of examples, or Alicia saying here, it's a living setting.
Yeah.
Magical forest or city. There are always exceptions.
Kind of like
Um,
Kit in Knight Rider.
yeah, that I thought of that too. But in that case, Kit is a character, right?
Yeah.
Just a character
True.
you can
Very
sit
true.
inside of.
Yeah.
And there's been a bit of a bustle in chat here. TW asking, can a relationship be with the main character, like in Fight Club, understanding and discovering themselves? I'm gonna say yes, you have a relationship with yourself, but discovering yourself and understanding yourself, that's more of like an internal conflict that we'll talk about next week when we talk about conflicts than a relationship. And you don't like, it's not like you need to categorize these things. You only benefit in so much as you benefit from categorizing them and understanding them. But I would definitely put that under conflict rather than relationship.
And by mentioning that in a comment, TW broke the first rule.
Yeah, right. You're out.
And the second rule.
Right.
Okay, so for romance, for relationships, have you guys thought about any specific relationships for your stories? Have you mapped any out at all, or like I know
Yes.
Hank, you mentioned you have the main character has a girlfriend, has a
Yes.
grandmother that provided this bursary.
Yes. Yes. Uh there are 4 main relationships that build the backbone of the story I'm telling, I think. So
Okay.
and it will alternate between the 4 relationships, and how they ultimately overlap and interact is really the entirety of the story I'm telling.
Excellent.
The only one that I've well, obviously the one between my main character and his friend, but there's the a turning relationship that I have planned is between the main character and a local. Uh, I haven't decided which country I'm setting this in, so I haven't figured out exactly the nationality of this person. But whoever this foreign operative is, she is basically the equivalent of a CIA operative for the country that they're in. And she starts out the story as an antagonist to the main character, and their relationship is very antagonistic between each other. And then they kind of figure out as the story goes on that they're on the same side. And so they go from being antagonistic to working together, and she becomes one of the only people that he can rely on to accomplish the mission. And so figuring out the negative aspects of their relationship, um, to not go overboard with that. To 'cause, I think sometimes it's very difficult to temper going between antagonistic to working together in a way that really makes sense, and especially in the small scale of one book, or several sequences or whatever. um, and figuring out the best way to do that. I definitely don't want them killing each other the first time they meet, but they've got to have some type of negative interaction the first time they meet, and that's got to develop additional tension in the book that eventually and logically has to work itself out so that they can work together at the end.
in one of the books that I co-authored. Bye, Hank.
Bye, Hank.
In one of the books that I co-authored, I had our main character, like special forces kind of person, who took a super soldier serum, and he got beat up by a vampire the first time he encountered this vampire, and then later went
Nice.
on to team up with her. And I got a 2-star review on that, complaining that the main character got, quote, beat like a redheaded stepchild, which kind of hit a little close to home for me.
Nice. Nice.
So that's what that reminded me of.
So their whole 2-star review was that the main character got beat up.
Yeah,
Huh.
by a lady vampire. So
Interesting.
yeah. So for my relationships, I've pulled in a couple, and I have the one that's ultimately going to result in romance, and that's very much tied to my main character's arc. The other character is very supportive, encouraging, and ultimately needs to be saved. But I also came up with, by figuring out this traumatic past, I have this other character who's in the same legion or unit as my main character, who is very much battle happy, very eager to fight, kind of like our main character used to be. And so now she taunts our main character every now and then in like a more than rivalry kind of way, like an antagonistic kind of way, like, this is how you used to be, I miss the old you kind
Right.
of thing. So that's going to
Right.
be fun to play with. But I will share real quick what my homework exercises look like. So this is the template that we've made for coming up with relationships. I went here and just listed out who they are and who they are to my character, and then some secondary relationships that I haven't fully thought about yet, but I know the characters are going to be there. And then went into detail with, like, extreme detail with one of the characters, the leader and eventual love interest. And it was through this actually that I fleshed out more and more of the beats that I want to hit and the scenes that I want to write, when we get to that point in the planning process. What I did think about too, though, when I was doing all this relationship stuff, is if you go to plot here in Dabble, you have the option to create a generic plot grid, which isn't attached to scenes. Right? It's just that, no scene column. And what I thought about doing is, my main character's name is Nightmare, so we'll just do that. And then Emmanuel is another one, and Lita is that antagonistic one that I thought of. And I thought about doing a sort of like grid of relationships. This is if you really want to map it out. So this one would be, NA, because or your relationship with yourself if you want.
Right.
But I could put here, love interest, and then list out the beats that I want to hit in this one. And that's just another form of outlining that you could do. And then eventually, like, depending on how big your cast is, if you want to organize these at all, like, I'd also have my antagonist. Here we could put, angry and violent. And then however you want to map the relationship. Just one way of using a different style of plot grid if you want to. For anyone watching, I personally, I don't think I'm going to dive this deep into relationships, but I know some people do. So, okay. Alrighty. And I think, Hank's going to miss the most fun part, but I think that ultimately brings us to the end of our show today. I will say, for everyone watching, whether with us or afterwards, consider this your homework assignment to go and start working on the week 2 exercises. At least do your protagonists. Really get to know your protagonists. The more you know them, the easier it's going to be to map out the rest of your book, and then ultimately write, 1,667 words a day in November. That's our goal, is making everything as efficient and smooth as possible when we hit that November 1st mark. Josh, anything you want to add before we bid adieu?
No, I think maybe the best thing that I can think of is keep it very simple, and don't get overwhelmed in one particular aspect. If you think your character needs a relationship in some form, jot it down. If they don't, then don't worry about it. If they don't interact with another character, you don't even have to think about their involvement at all. If they have a character arc, think about that, but leave a lot of space to play around with that. If they have an interesting backstory, have the idea in your mind, but be confident in the story that you're trying to tell. That if the backstory that you think of doesn't line up with the story the way it evolves, throw the backstory out. You don't. I think this is the biggest thing that people don't like about plotting is they get stuck on, well, it doesn't fit all of this. If the story you're trying to tell doesn't match the backstory or the world building or whatever, and that's the story you want to tell, feel free to change stuff. You can change the backstory of your character. It's not set in stone. If you need them to do something else, go back and delete. Well, don't delete because you want you want the 50,000 words, but change it, right? Like, just don't feel constricted by it, and that's why I don't do a lot of front end backstory work, because sometimes even if you have it in your mind like I do that it's not going to affect the fundamental writing of the story, if you've done that work, then you kind of in your mind are like, I've done all that work, I'm not just going to have it be for nothing, I have to use it, I have to figure it out. Even if you do the work, like write 2,500 words on a backstory scene, if you get to a point in the book where you're going strong and your story's flowing and everything works, and you get to the point where that backstory makes sense or matters to the scene, but it's incorrect, throw it out. Get rid of it or change it. Don't let the backstory that you envision for your character control the story that you're trying to tell, because the backstory is just flavor. The story is key. And so if anything doesn't match up with the story that you're trying to tell, don't worry about it.
Yeah. The all the work that we have here is meant to help. It's meant to, grease the wheels. It's meant to only be as useful as it is to you. So do what works for you. If you don't want to spend 15,000 words exploring character backstories, that's fine. I'll still call you a distinguished person. And
I watched a great documentary the other night about songwriters, and one person said there are 2,000 different ways to write a song. Pick one. And I thought that was great, that we all have different ways that we approach storycraft, and we all have different goals, and ultimately you've just got to pick the one that works for you and just do it. That
100%.
Showing up and doing the work is, all the other stuff is there to support what you do, but if you don't do what you do, then there's no, all of this is for nothing.
Sure.
And on that, I think we're going to call it here. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. If you made it live, I'd like to thank you if you're watching after the fact and catching up. Head on over to the Storycraft Cafe. That's storycraft.cafe. Join the challenge there and chat with your fellow participants. Share your work. Leave feedback on others if they're looking for it. Hank, Josh, thank you for a wonderful show. And good luck on your characters, everyone. We will see you back here. Same bat time, same bat place. Next Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.